Okay, let's start. Today we have my esteemed colleague, Bansi Malde, who's going to tell us all about the RCT they ran a couple of years ago in India. So as usual, please, except Bansi, of course, please mute your microphones and unmute if you have any questions during the presentation. Bansi, you're happy to take questions during
Yes.
presentation. And just to also kind of, as usual, the seminar is being recorded and will be available online on GLO website by tomorrow or maximum Monday. Okay, over to you, Nancy.
Okay. Thank you, Matlub, for the invitation to present in this seminar series. And as Matlub said, I'm very happy to take any feedback or questions as we go along. Feel free to interrupt. So this is joint work with Amrit, who's in the audience and can also help answer some of the questions. Irma, Clots-Figueras, Anirban, Mitra, Debayan, Pakrashi, and Zaki, Wahhaj. And our focus is on the take-up of government benefits. And this is motivated very much by this observation that we often see significant gaps between program entitlements and what beneficiaries actually receive from social welfare programs. And one major reason for this in developing country settings is leakages or corruption, where the aid or the entitlement just does not get to the beneficiaries. And these types of leakages get worse during crises and emergencies, where timely access to these benefits is essential to limit economic damages. And this was something that was especially salient during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw over 3,000 social welfare measures implemented in over 200 economies at quite a significant cost. So it's very important to identify the underlying drivers of this gap for both efficiency and equity reasons. And there is an active literature in economics that has suggested a few different reasons. On the demand side, we have constraints such as preferences or stigma that prevent people from claiming benefits. Procrastination or lack of information can also play this type of role. And on the supply side, corruption and leakage, lack of institutional capacity, complexity of programs also put off people from claiming their benefits. What's more, beliefs about these constraints can also play a critical role and reduce effort made to receive benefits. So in this paper, we're going to focus specifically on the role of information constraints and answer two sets of questions. The first is, to what extent do informational constraints drive this gap? And also, how can policymakers close this gap? Now, conceptually, providing information can improve take-up by, on the one hand, just closing knowledge gaps and informing beneficiaries about their eligibility, entitlements, the process, and so on. On the other hand, this information can also empower beneficiaries to demand their entitlements. But information on its own might not be sufficient if there are other constraints. And so whether these sorts of information constraints exist and how they can be effectively relaxed is an empirical question.
Sorry, Bansi, how is the information given? I mean, how do people find out if they're eligible or not?
Okay, well, I'll come to it in the next couple of slides if you're happy to wait till
sure,
then. Yeah. So in this paper, what we're going to do is to study the effects of providing personalized information on emergency government benefits using a cluster randomized control trial that we conducted among slum households in the city of Kanpur in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India towards the end of the first wave of the COVID pandemic. Now, among these slum households, I'd say the main sources of information might be their social contacts, and they might also have heard something in the news. but often it's social contacts who are the main sources of information. Now, this is Kanpur in India, in Uttar Pradesh, is a setting with high corruption or leakage and perceptions of leakage in these government programs. And our intervention focused specifically on aid from two programs, one that provided food aid and a second that provided cash transfers to women. We used detailed data collected 1 to 2 months after the intervention to document the impacts of the intervention and to study mechanisms. And we're focused on a set of outcomes, including knowledge and receipt of aid, the gap between receipt and entitlement, food security, food expenditures, and well-being, including mental health and life satisfaction. And then to study mechanisms, we'll also look at outcomes related to corruption and contacts with program officials. So just to give you a preview of the findings, we see that at baseline, households were overestimating how much they were eligible to get from each of these two programs, but at the same time, they were receiving less than their entitlements on average. And 1 month after our intervention, the treated households had corrected their beliefs about the entitlements, and they were receiving more benefits from each of these programs, reducing this gap between entitlements and receipt. We then study what mechanisms drive the reduction of this gap, and we find evidence consistent with the hypothesis that information empowered beneficiaries to get the aid without having to pay a bribe. We also show that the intervention improved households' well-being, it improved their food security, it reduced their out-of-pocket household expenditures, and improved different measures of well-being, including mental health. So just to say a little bit about where we think this paper contributes. So we contribute first to this large and growing literature on take-up of social programs or government programs, which has found, and this is a literature for both developing and developed countries, and this has found mixed evidence on the effectiveness of providing information. And what's interesting is that not very many interventions actually provide personalized information. There are the few studies which have done so, for instance, this paper by Banerjee and co-authors published in the Journal of Political Economy. So we contribute to this literature by studying the effects of an emergency government aid program, and we're also able to look at these downstream outcomes beyond receipt of aid. We also contribute to a second literature which studies the role of information as providing empowerment or information as an accountability mechanism. And work here is often concentrated in developing countries where the existing evidence is again mixed on effectiveness across contexts and outcomes in mostly rural populations. We're going to add to this literature by studying urban slum households that have essentially not been studied very much in this literature. So before I continue, I can stop and take any questions or any comments at this stage.
I just kind of want to understand, so you're going to talk about the mechanisms later, yes. But in these people who have done this work that you list here, I mean, what's the prior? I mean, how is information going to have an impact? Because if I'm an official and I'm corrupt, then I can still kind of make it difficult, even if you have information that you are entitled to something.
So the idea is that so there are some studies which make use of this information for instance, this the paper by Bjorkman and Svensson. It's not just provision of information, but it's also getting a community together to see that, oh, look, this they're looking at health centers, local health centers. So there is also an element of collective action to try and improve, to try and demand better services. So there's information combined with collective action to allow them to do that. The paper by Banerjee and co-authors provided they provided beneficiaries of a food aid program in Indonesia with a card which listed how much subsidy they were eligible for. So the idea here is that you could use that card to go to the intermediary who might have been, fobbing you off, saying, no, you're wrong. You're actually entitled to less than what you think you are. But now you can take that card to the intermediary and say, no, I know what my rights are, and it improves your bargaining position with regards to the intermediary. So it could be either just, having that information from a credible source increases your own confidence in the information, allowing you to negotiate more effectively, or it could also be something about just providing this, in the case of Banerjee and others, the card, or also some of these, including the Banerjee one, provided information on how to complain if you don't get your entitled aid. So,
and do they also study kind of the delay? So if they have the information, but you can delay the whole process, right? So you can say, come back tomorrow or whatever, or next week.
I think their outcomes just look at how much people were receiving.
Okay. So it's just like eventually they receive it. That's the idea.
Well, it would be within a certain time period. So one way of, it could be that they're not being delayed anymore, but if it's, long enough, say it's, how much you received in the last month or last 2 months, it might be long enough for things like food aid. I think, that should capture any delays as well. But I would double check that Banerjee paper to see what the time period was. But that's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just go straight into giving you some more details on the context. So our intervention took place in 2020 during the first year of the COVID crisis. And we're working in India, which had imposed a very strict and unanticipated nationwide lockdown with about 4 hours notice on the 24th of March 2020, at a time when COVID cases were low. So this lockdown itself had large negative economic impacts. So India's economy contracted by close to 8% in the 2020-21 financial year, versus, in other developing countries, on average, this was around 2.2%. And in our sample of urban slum households, 88% of households reported having lost all or part of the income of the main earner. Now, in response to these large negative economic impacts, the government created at a very great pace and announced very quickly a set of social protection measures. And amongst this quite broad set of measures, there were 2 programs that we're going to focus on in this paper. And both of these were announced on the 26th of March 2020 and extended later as the crisis extended. The first program is the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, where ration card holders were entitled to receive additional food grains for free. And the second program was the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, where account holders were to receive 500 rupees per month in their accounts for 3 months, and 1,000 rupees for widows and disabled people. And these transfers were made into bank accounts directly by the government.
Can I just can you go back to the last slide? Just a question, marginal question. You say 88% of households have been affected. Well, this means practically everybody. Can you differentiate between a lot and not so much, or something, or do you just know whether there was some impact? Because this is a likely effect, so there should have been an impact.
Yeah, so I think we can differentiate between having lost all of the income or part of the income.
Okay.
And yes, we can do that. I don't remember the breakdown, but we can differentiate by that. I think we have a third category, two more categories, one more category where they just said they weren't affected. And that's about 12% of the sample.
Okay, thanks.
Now, both of these programs extended benefits to existing beneficiaries of existing programs. So for the food grain distribution, there were they extended benefits to beneficiaries of the public distribution system that provides subsidized food grains. Whereas Jan Dhan was focused on bank accounts that were opened for unbanked women since 2014 under this Jan Dhan program. And the program succeeded in opening over 400 million of these no-frills bank accounts. The other feature I want to highlight here is that getting the aid required interaction with intermediaries. So households needed to go to a ration shop or a public distribution system shop to get the food grains. And in order to get the cash transfer, they would need to still go to a banking agent to reactivate dormant accounts or to banks to do so, and also to obtain the information on how much balance there was in the account and to withdraw cash. Now, Matlub, to answer your question on what information was available, so information on these emergency benefits was very widely reported in the press, but it was bundled with several other policy announcements. And I think this is also an important feature of emergencies and crises. The final thing I want to mention about the context is that there was the households in our sample perceived quite high levels of corruption in these programs. So 80% believe that government officials are either highly or very highly corrupt, and 45% believe that the ration shops are highly or very highly corrupt. Now, our study took place in the city of Kanpur, which is the largest city in Uttar Pradesh. Now, Uttar Pradesh has a population of over 200 million people, and it's also home to one of the largest slum populations in India. We worked with a co-author. Debayan was at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur at that time. So we worked them to send 2 SMS messages to respondents, which describe the emergency government benefits available through the food grain distribution program and through Jan Dhan. Now, these messages were followed up with a phone call by a trained female enumerator who provided information on the household's program eligibility and entitlement. And this was tailored to the household based on a baseline survey that we'd conducted. And we also provided contact details of program officials. Now, the enumerators followed a script that was tailored to the household based on this survey. To give you an idea of how we did the tailoring, here's the script for a household that was eligible for the food grain distribution, but wasn't receiving their entitled benefits. So there, the enumerator would tell them that you told my colleague that you're a beneficiary under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana and that you or your household has a ration card. If this is correct, then you were entitled to receive 5 kg of rice or wheat for each household member listed on the ration card per month during the months April to November 2020. And in addition, your family was entitled to receive 1 kilogram of pulses per month during these months. We also provided that contact information. We provided the website, a contact number, and a toll-free phone number as well.
Is it common to have, for people in this area to have a mobile phone?
It is. Yes, so there's high mobile phone penetration in India, and in urban areas it's very high. So I think over 90% have a mobile phone. And that's really important because our intervention and our our data collection, everything takes place over the phone, primarily because of restrictions due to COVID. Okay, so just to give you an overview of the timeline of our project. So we started with a list of households our co-author Debayan had surveyed previously, and in that he'd got some phone numbers from these households. So he verified these in August of 2020, conducted the baseline survey between September and October, and our randomization and intervention took place in November, and we collected end-line data about a month after the end of the intervention. So our sample comes from a list of these 1,800 households from 60 slums, and these slums were initially selected using stratified random sampling. And for these 1,800 households, these are households for whom phone numbers had been confirmed in 2019 from a previous survey conducted by Debayan. From this list of 1,800 households, we randomly selected 1,200 for the baseline survey, and we successfully interviewed 1,006 of these after we removed invalid or no response phone numbers. At our end line, which took place about 4 months later, we succeed in getting almost all except for 13 of these households. So we have quite a low attrition rate. Now we allocate, this is a randomized controlled trial where we allocate slums to two treatment arms or a control. And then within the slums, we select 75% of the households to actually receive the intervention, with the remaining 25% in our sample remaining untreated, and they allow us to measure within slum spillovers. So in a couple of slides, I'll explain the design in a bit more detail. But before I do that, let me just give you some more details on the survey and the respondent. So the respondent of the survey was usually a female aged between 18 and 62 years. She was typically either the head of the household or the spouse of the head. 82% of our sample is Hindu, 18% Muslim, 23% from a general caste. Households have on average 5.3 members. 48% were day laborers, so they and 27% were business owners. 91% of our sample was eligible for the food grain distribution, and 56% for Jandan. And as I said, they were quite badly hit by this, by the lockdowns and the COVID crisis. Now, typically, they told us that they were relying primarily on their own savings or government aid to cope. And we have compared the characteristics of our sample with those of households in the National Family Health Survey, the 5th round of which took place around the same time. And we see that our study sample characteristics are similar in many dimensions with those in the bottom 60% of the wealth distribution in this in the NFHS 5 survey. The one dimension on which there are differences is education. So our sample is slightly better educated than that in the bottom 60% of the NFHS. Okay, so let me go in more depth into our experimental design. So we have these 1,006 households that reside in 60 slums. So in our first step of randomization, we randomly allocate the 60 slums into one of 3 groups. In the first group, which we call the male treatment group, sample households received information, but this information was given to a male member of the household. In the second group, which is a female treatment group, the information provided was to a female member of the household. And in the third group, which are 20 slums, these households are our control group, which didn't receive any information from us. Now, within the treated slums, as I said, we give information to only 75% of the households in our sample. So this leaves us with about 242 treated households in the male treatment arm and 244 treated households in the female treatment arm. And the remaining 90 untreated households in each arm allow us to measure the magnitude of spillovers. So these treated households receive the information, and then we survey all of them, including the control households in our inline survey. So this is just a map giving you the distribution of the slums, the study slums, and it's fairly even across the city. So in what follows, we'll estimate intent to treat effects using the following regression. We're going to regress our outcomes of interest on dummies for whether a household is in a slum that was treated with either, will have a dummy for being in a slum that's got the male treatment or the female treatment, and that's interacted with this indicator for being directly treated in the treated slum. So these coefficients beta R are going to tell us the impacts of our intervention on the directly treated households in either the male treatment slum or the female treatment slum. We then include additional dummy variables or indicators for households that were not treated but were living in treatment slums. So these are our spillover households. And so we're going to have these ETAs capturing the impacts for these spillover households in the treated slums. We control for a set of control variables, typically the outcome, the baseline value of the outcome, to try to improve power, and also on some variables on which there was a small imbalance at baseline. We're going to cluster all our standard errors at the slum level, and in the tables I'll present, we're going to be also doing multiple hypothesis testing. So we'll also report, actually it's Westphal-Young p-values to control for multiple hypothesis testing. Now, so the roadmap of the results I'm going to present, I'll start by showing you the impacts on knowledge and awareness of the programs, and so whether they're aware of the programs themselves and their entitlements from these. After that, I'll show results on the benefits received, including the impacts on gaps between receipts and entitlement and gaps between receipts and beliefs. And thereafter, I'll show you what we do to investigate the mechanisms driving the impacts we see on gaps between receipt and entitlement. And in the final bit, I'll talk briefly about the intervention impacts on food security and well-being. Now, in what follows, I'm going to show you first the impacts on the directly treated households, and then come to discussions on the spillovers later on in the talk. So before I proceed, are there any questions?
Yeah, I just trying to understand. So what's the nature of the household? I mean, people are like parents are living with people, sort of a bigger household, right? So it could be that there is a widow, but the household that was the intervention was to a male member who was maybe the father or the father-in-law or whatever. Is that's a possibility?
Yeah, so these are urban slum households. So there would be some extended family households, but there are also quite a lot of nuclear households, because these are slum households that have usually moved from some rural village to the city, and that's so And it's true that the recipient of the information need not necessarily be the beneficiary of the program.
Yeah, that's all I was trying to get to. Yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons we had this design was to try to test whether it matters who you give the information to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Maybe another clarification question, if I may.
Yes.
So households get two kinds of information treatments, right? So one is standardized via the SMS, and the other one is personalized information via the telephone interview or in telephone call, right?
Yes.
Can you differentiate in the end, like which message was more important, like the standardized one or the personalized one?
Yeah, so our design doesn't allow us to differentiate between the two. So our co-author Debayan had another paper, which I think is out in the Review of Economics and Statistics, where they show that those follow-up phone calls in the context of giving information about health and COVID. So in that context, those follow-up phone calls were very important. So a lot more than just sending text messages.
Because I'm just asking because one is obviously cheaper than the other. So
Yeah.
I was just curious about the effectiveness, right?
Yeah, so based on this other work by Debayan and his co-authors, which showed that once you follow up these text messages with so the text messages themselves don't have much of an impact, but if they're followed up by the phone calls, they have a much larger impact. So based on we built on that to include the phone calls here. And this made sense also because this is a relatively vulnerable population, and I think having that phone call might allow them to have more confidence in the information given compared to the SMS messages themselves.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go straight into the results. And I'm going to first show you a couple of pictures of distributions of what households believe they're entitled to receive from in terms of food grains. And on the left panel, we have their beliefs about food grains at baseline, and the right panel, it's at end line. We see at baseline the distributions for the three groups, the control, which is the dark line, and the two dashed lines for the male and female treatments are very similar. So we have a few, not very many households on the left tail. So there are few people who are underestimating their entitlements. Quite a lot who had the correct beliefs, but also a significant minority or significant proportion actually who believe that they should be receiving more than their entitlement. By end line, what we see is that the peaks, so the mass of the sample mass that was on the right-hand side of 0 for the two treatment groups shifts away from that part of the distribution to 0. So essentially, all these people who are overestimating correct their beliefs and have accurate beliefs at end line. Now, this effect is a lot more evident when we look at Jan Dan, where we see this quite broad distribution, very similar across the three treatment arms at baseline. But by end line, the two households in the two treatment groups have very accurate beliefs about their entitlements, whereas there's no updating at all within the control group. So in regression terms, what we see is that there is very little impact of our information on the extensive margins, so whether they are aware of the program or not. And that's not surprising because there's quite, even amongst the control households, since this was an extension of existing benefits that they were aware of, there was very high knowledge about their eligibility for these programs. But where we see this, the largest impacts are on updating of beliefs around their entitlements, and these coefficients are negative, but that's not a bad thing because they're basically reducing their overestimation of entitlements. And this is evident when we look at the gap between their beliefs and their entitlement. And we see that in control, they're still overestimating how much they should receive, but this gap is closed in the two treatment arms. Now, following on from Matloub's questions about, we had given information to a female member, a male member, and we actually don't see much of a difference in the impacts between the two groups. As you'll see later, this is the case across quite a lot of our outcomes. So to summarize, we see no effects on the extensive margin, a significant reduction in knowledge gaps for all programs, and these households were overestimating these entitlements. But again, no difference in impacts between the female and male treatment arms. And our estimated impacts are robust to adjustments for multiple hypothesis testing.
Sorry, Bansi, could you remind me how the beliefs are determined?
So the beliefs, we ask the households, so can you tell us how much you should be getting from these programs? We ask them how much they should get per person and how many people are eligible.
So this is slightly different, right? So should be means that this is what they in the sense that it's not saying that this is what the program entitles you. Should or could also mean that, oh, I should be getting more money. I mean, government should be giving more money. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I think I misspoke with the phrasing, I think, was not actually how much should you be getting. It's how much you think you should be. Yeah, so how much do you think you should be getting?
Yeah, but I mean, so that can have a different connotation, right? So if you say that, what do you think you are entitled to?
Yeah.
The program is more specific, like a belief thing, rather than what you think you should be getting. Which meant,
I will double check the phrasing because I could be wrong when I say how much do you think you should be getting. I'll double check it because we were trying to get at how much are you entitled to get. So I'll double check the phrasing.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, we then look at what are the impacts on how much they're receiving from the programs. And on the extensive margin, whether they're getting anything or not, we don't see any impacts whatsoever. Where we do see impacts is in the amount they're receiving. And in particular, we see that there's an increase of around 5 kilograms more grains on average from the food grain distribution, and about 120 to 130 rupees more from the cash transfer program. And this increase leads to a reduction in this gap between how much they receive and their entitlement. And we see this go down by close to 6 kilograms for the food aid distribution, and around between 100 and 140 rupees for the Jan Dhan program. And there is a larger impact on the gaps between receipts and beliefs, but part of this gap is coming from having updated those beliefs. So something that just to summarize, we've seen the significant increase in amounts, and these are quite significant. So the 5.26 kg accounts for around 29% over the increase over the average in control group, and the 125 rupees is around 48% increase over the control group average. So again, we don't see much of a difference between the female and male treatment arms. And something that puzzled us a little bit was that we were interested in learning more about is what is it that's driving the increase in benefits and the reduction in the gap between receipt and eligibility. So we consider three key channels. The first is that maybe our program reduced stigma or altered preferences. But we think this is very unlikely since the households were already claiming benefits from these programs prior to the intervention, and COVID was a very, very large shock. The second is that this could have just provided information that reduced knowledge gaps and misperceptions. But we saw that the intervention corrected knowledge of entitlements, but households were overestimating before the intervention. So it's very unlikely that households were not claiming their benefits because they believed that they were not large enough. So this leaves us with the third channel, which is this empowerment effect, where the provision of this personalized information from a credible source on what they were supposed to receive and the contact numbers might have empowered them to make the effort to get the benefits. And we think this is an important channel in this context, given the high corruption or perceptions of corruption, where pre-intervention, some of these households might have made an unsuccessful effort to obtain aid, or because of this perceptions of corruption and a history of politicians over-promising, that might have discouraged effort to get the aid itself. Now, we think we test this more formally. So we test more formally whether the impacts are driven by this information channel, so reducing these knowledge gaps, or by the empowerment channel, by studying heterogeneous treatment effects, by whether households had correct beliefs about their entitlements at baseline, and whether they were receiving the full entitlement at baseline. So we're going to divide our sample into these 4 subgroups and study heterogeneous effects of our intervention on the gap between receipt and eligibility, and some survey questions on corruption, contacts, and perceptions. Now, we interpret the way to think about this test is that if we see any, we have our first subgroup of households who at baseline had correct beliefs about their entitlements, but were not receiving their full entitlements. And so any impacts we see on these households should be due to an empowerment effect. In our second subgroup of households, where they were overestimating how much they should receive, but were also not receiving their full entitlement, any impacts we see on this set of households will be because of both an empowerment and information effect. Amongst households who are receiving their full entitlement but had incorrect beliefs, any impacts we see should be because of an information effect. And finally, for the households that had correct beliefs and were receiving their full entitlement, we don't really expect either of these channels to play a role there. So we estimate these heterogeneous treatment effects where on the gap between receipt and eligibility, where our reference category that's captured by the coefficient on this variable t is the group which was not overestimating at baseline, so they had accurate beliefs, but were not receiving their full entitlement at baseline. And we see that amongst this group, there is a positive and significant effect on this gap between receipt and eligibility. So we see that this gap is being closed for this group of households. Now, the interaction terms for the households that were already receiving the full entitlement are negative. So if you add these interaction terms to the coefficient on the treatment dummy, we're going to get something that's close to 0, and we can see that it's also statistically significantly not different from 0. And the final group at the bottom here, who were overestimating at baseline and were not receiving the full entitlement, can tell us, this interaction term can tell us something about the additional information effect on top of this empowerment effect. And what we see is that this coefficient is close to 0, and it's much smaller, and it's statistically significantly, it's not statistically significant. So what do we take away from this set of heterogeneous treatment effects? We see that the gap reduced for those who had correct beliefs, but not the full entitlement, which is consistent with there being an empowerment effect. But it was nearly unchanged for those who received their full entitlement at baseline, which suggests that there was no pure information effect. We also don't see any significant differences between our base or reference category and those who were overestimating and had incorrect beliefs. It suggests that there is no information effect on top of empowerment. And this shows that our results are purely due to the empowerment effect. We then validate this mechanism using information using another program on which we also provided information called the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwal Yojana, where existing beneficiaries of this program were entitled to free monthly refills of liquefied petroleum gas. Now, this program, unlike the other two, was actually functioning relatively well in urban areas, and there were few concerns about corruption, mainly because traders were receiving the full market price. So for this program, we expect an information effect, but not an empowerment effect. And so when we look at the impacts of this, of our intervention or our providing this information on the beliefs, we see they are updating the beliefs. They're less likely to overestimate at timeline. And that closes the gap between beliefs and entitlement. We don't see an increase in their amounts received, and not much happening with the gap between receipts and entitlement. And this small positive effect is driven by an outlier. So it's not a very robust one. So we then provide further further evidence in line with this empowerment channel by looking at impacts, again, these heterogeneous.
Sorry, yes. Bansi, 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about this and then go through the rest. So yeah, I think I'll be fine. So we look at some more direct measures of what we can think of as effort to get aid, and also on perceptions of corruption. And then we ask them, and we have these measures of whether they would be willing to contact local elected officials or the public distribution shop. This is the one that distributes the food aid. And what we see is that amongst the group that had correct beliefs but were not receiving the full aid, we see that there is this increased willingness to contact the local elected officials and the public distribution system shop. This effect is not statistically, the interaction terms here are not significant, but if we look at the joint tests for the coefficient on treatment plus these interaction terms, we see they're not significant from 0 because these are quite noisy, which suggests that essentially the households that were not receiving their full entitlement and the ones who had correct beliefs were the ones who were most likely to increase their willingness to contact these officials or the PDS shop, which is in line with the empowerment channel. If we look at actual contacts, see that the largest effects are also amongst these two subgroups, though across the board they're more likely to contact the local officials. Now, very interestingly, we see that there is a reduction in perception of corruption amongst the ration shop or the PDS shop, primarily in the arm where we see the empowerment effect. So they're the ones who were not receiving the full entitlement but had accurate beliefs. So receiving more aid has reduced their perceptions of corruption. And what's more, they were also less likely to report having paid a bribe at our end line. And the remaining interaction terms are very noisy. So so that's just something to keep in mind. So the takeaway here is that when we look at measures of effort and corruption, we see that consistent with the empowerment channel, the households in the group that had accurate beliefs and but were not receiving the full entitlement, were they increased their likelihood of contacting officials, willingness to contact these officials, and actual contacts with them, and update their perceptions of corruption and pay less bribes. Now, we then look at the impacts of the information on food security and well-being. We find a reduction in food insecurity, and households also reduce their food expenditures, probably in response to the increased food grains they receive. We also see that mental well-being improves with a larger improvement in the male treatment arm. So this is one of the outcomes in which we see a difference between the female and male treatment arms. And we also see improvements in life satisfaction and financial satisfaction. Now, let me talk a little bit about spillovers. These were very important to understand for the design of effective policies. But in our design, we find mostly null effects of information spillovers within slums. That's not because households were not sharing information with people outside the household. They were doing so. But we think that 1 month might have been too short for it to have diffused to the spillover households in the treated slums. We were also providing personalized information. And this is a period with COVID where there were restrictions on face-to-face contact. So we think that all these things might have just slowed down diffusion of this type of information. And then again, for the male versus female treatment, as I said, we find mostly null effects for differences in information provision between genders, which suggests relatively frictionless information sharing within the household in this context. But we think that this is a type of information in which there is actually no strategic motive to withhold information. Now, one outcome which is quite interesting is that women have better mental health when their husbands or the male member is treated, which suggests that there might be a cost or mental cost of acting on information that affects the recipients, the information recipient's mental health.
Okay.
So I'll just conclude now.
Good.
I won't repeat what I've just said about the results, but let me just give one slide on scalability and external validity. So we think our approach holds great promise in other low and middle income settings, given this widespread adoption of mobile phones. And there is an increase in there's an increasing frequency of emergencies, and very unfortunately, but this is happening. And so there is a potential. So this offers one potential intervention that could be used, and we think it holds quite a great potential to scale up at a lower cost than in-person interventions. We know that there are some other, SMS messages or chatbots that could be cheaper, but often we find they're not very effective. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions or comments at this point.
Great. Thank you, Bansi. Any questions?
So I see something in the chat.
No, I think Amrit addressed the question about the survey questionnaire thing. Just one thing, I suppose the difference, I mean, I think we might have mentioned something along those lines, but it could be that that people knew about the information, or some people knew about the information, or more than we think they did, but they didn't know who to contact. So it's in a way the contact was much more, that information might be, and I don't know if it's easy to disentangle that more precisely. that, you know, giving that number, because you're in your treatment, you said it's the text was full thing, sort of included contact and information.
Yeah.
But it could be that it's the contact that matters. You know, a lot of times I want to do something even in this country, and I don't know how to get sort of go about doing it, because you know, contacts are kind of
So I think that's actually really interesting. So we've not shown these results here, but it will be in the next version of the paper. We did measure whether people know who to contact.
Okay.
And the effects of providing this information. And, you know, in the control group at N-Line, for the food aid program, for instance, I think less than 20% said, yes, I know who to contact. Now, our intervention increases that to about 66 or 65%. So there's a really large impact on knowledge of who to contact for all three programs. So, you know, that's certainly something that could be driving this effect. But at the same time, we're seeing that the beliefs were also updated, and the contact information actually would probably also be in line with the empowerment channel. And that's just simply because these households were already getting aid from these programs. So they were getting something, but they were just not getting the full entitlement. So it's not that they didn't know where to go to get it.
Yeah.
But it was just that they were not getting the full entitlement. And just to give just like one anecdote, our co-author told us was a lot of these households, when they were running their baseline survey, were saying things like, yeah, you know, for the food grain distribution, it was, yeah, we're getting something, but they're not giving us, you know, they're not giving us the entitlement. So many of these households knew they were not getting their full entitlement, believed they weren't getting it. And it could be just, we've seen also other qualitative work in other contexts saying for food grain distribution, they were giving some aid, but maybe they'd give it, say there were 4 people listed on the ration card, but the PDF shop guy would say, okay, I'm just giving you food for 3 people, not for 4. So, yeah.
Interesting. Any other questions? Going one, going
maybe one, if I may.
Okay, yes.
Okay. So I was wondering, it's very impressive work. Thanks for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. So one thing I was wondering a bit about is, so I'm not familiar with the literature, I have to say, but you told about other studies that also look in like similar context at information provision. And I was wondering, so your information that you give is basically this personalized intervention and some basic knowledge. And I was wondering, so your intervention is different from what the other studies in literature do. And can you say something about your effect sizes that, like in comparison with other studies? So do people then update better than just having like general information, or do they claim more money also? I don't know whether you can say something about that.
Yeah, that's a very very good question. So I think I'd say that, yeah, we should definitely do this. If I remember the Banerjee and co-authors paper, I think their effect sizes, for instance, in how much additional food subsidy households were getting, I think theirs might be slightly smaller than ours, but you know, it's a different context there. Here, this is an emergency context where there was much higher demand for these for the food aid than you know, in the standard food subsidy. Every month you get the same food subsidy type program. But that's it's a very good question. I think and that's something we should actually look at and see if we can benchmark our effect sizes with other studies. I think we've not seen many studies that have found this type of overestimation. And it was something that actually puzzled us for a little while, but I think we see now that actually the information it's not surprising. The information actually just helped. It increased access mainly by empowering people rather than going through this beliefs channel.
Okay, I think we'll stop here. We're just slightly over, which is when we started as well. So you got full hour, Bansi. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. That was really great work. And whenever the paper is ready, we would love to put it as along with the recording, which will go obviously tomorrow, but as a working paper on GLO.
Okay.
Okay. Until next month. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And again, if there are further questions, comments, please send me an email. Okay, thanks so much.
Bye.